Well, my dear friends, good evening or good day, depends on where you're coming from. Thank you so much for attending our continued lecture series. And again, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Father Peter Farrington from England, a Coptic priest who is going to talk to us today about Anglo-Saxon Christianity, but more precisely about the Christianity after the time of St. Augustine's mission. So please welcome Father Peter. And Father Peter, we're looking for your, as always, outstanding presentations. I'm going to give you the co-host privileges. The only thing is I'm going to turn the microphones off in case we'll have some unwarranted invasion. But at the end, if you'd like to, I'll be most happy to turn your microphones back on, and you could ask Father Peter all questions that you'd like to. Father Peter, thank you so much for being with us yet again, and we're very appreciative of all of your efforts and your knowledge, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for this third invitation, and it's a blessing in this time of lockdown that a few of us can gather together to share this interest. And truly, I love the history of Christianity in the West. I love all church history, but I love the history of the church in my own country very much. And most of those places that you described in your own road trip, I visited with very much affection, and some of them will feature in this presentation this evening. So I hope you can see the slide, and we're going to look at the period from the mission of Augustine, so the end of the 6th century, and we're going to look towards the end of the Anglo-Saxon period, which ends with the invasion of William the Conqueror, although we have another name for him here in the UK, which I won't give on this presentation, which brings to an end one chapter in our history. In actual fact, Queen Elizabeth II, our present monarch, has within her the blood of Harold II, the last Anglo-Saxon king. One of his children became part of the Danish royal family, and in the early 19th century, one of Queen Victoria's children, one of the heirs, married into the Danish royal family, and so in a roundabout route, the bloodline of our true English kings and queens returned to us from Harold II. So this is looking at those years from about 600 to about 1050, just before the Norman invasion. And Augustine, as you may well know, is the missionary who brings Christianity to the English in the South. The history of Britain, as we've looked at in the past 2 lectures, was one in which Christianity came to Britain with the Romans and became well established, so that to a great extent Britannia became a Christian province of the Roman Empire as much as anywhere else in the West. There were many bishops, priests, churches, many converts. We saw some photographs of a baptistry that was large enough for adults. So there were many adult converts, not just infant converts. And we understood in the first lecture that this period of Christianity in the Roman Empire lasted until about the 400s. In about 410, the Roman legions left Britain for the last time and left the Romanized Britons to their own devices and to defend themselves. And in about 450, the groans of the Britons, one of the historians says, were sent to the Romans, asking them if there was any possibility of assistance against the Irish on the one hand, the Picts invading from the north, and the Angles and Saxons invading from the east. But no help came. And that was where our second lecture began, which was with the period that's sometimes called the Dark Ages, although we saw some very beautiful cultural artifacts that showed that term, the Dark Ages, represented only a period of ignorance during the Victorian times, perhaps. Now archaeology and other research has given us much greater insight into the wealth of culture found during the period of the Anglo-Saxon invasion. But now we come to the point in time where the Christianized British have been pushed to the west into Cornwall and Devon, in the southwest of England, into Wales, into Cumbria, the Lake District, and into southern Scotland. And the Angles and Saxons are a pagan people worshipping the Norse gods and other Germanic gods. And to a great extent, we saw in our second lecture that Christianity in what we call England today went underground wherever it survived. We saw some traces of continuity. We saw that Christians did survive in various places, but mostly the things that we looked at were great lumps of rock and stone, which represented the evidence for Christianity in this period. Crosses and the names of monasteries and monks in Wales and in Cornwall. These were the evidence we found in our second lecture for the continuity of Christianity during this period of invasion, this 150 years during which the pagan Anglo-Saxons and Jutes slowly occupied much of mainland Britain. And so today our lecture begins with the reintroduction of Christianity to England, but not the coming of Christianity to the British Isles, of course. It would be a mistake for us to imagine that Christianity comes to the British Isles with Augustine. We've already seen that that's not true. But certainly it came to areas where Christianity had gone underground, if it survived at all. And in this lecture, we're going to see that much of what takes place is integrated with kings and kingdoms. It's to do with education and learning. It's to do with the creation of the foundations of medieval Christianity in Britain. It's not a matter of survival, it's a matter of mission, and then it's a matter of education, culture, civilization, with support from a surprising number of kings and nobles who make it possible. And we see this, I'll try to go at a fair pace because I have 32 slides, and if I talk for about 2 minutes on each one, then I won't keep you too long, although I've already kept you too long. This first slide is from Canterbury. Canterbury is about 18 miles away from me in that direction. I love to visit Canterbury. It's an important place in the history of Christianity in the British Isles. And what we can see here is a Roman building that had been converted into a place of worship at the time of the mission of St. Augustine. And so St. Augustine came to England, came to Kent in 597 AD. But he wasn't the first Christian in Kent. There was some continuity. We looked at that little glass bowl that was from Kent that seemed to be a communion chalice. And that came in the years in the middle of the Dark Ages. Maybe there was a continuity. But in this period, this recrudescence, revival of Christianity in the British Isles, before St. Augustine came, there was a queen, Bertha. And Bertha was married to Ethelbert, the king of the Kingdom of Kent. And he was a great king, and he was what the Anglo-Saxons called a Bretwalder, which represents a high king, the senior king among all of the small kingdoms which were present in England at that time. Kent actually takes its name from the British tribe that lived there, the Cantiarchi. And so even in the name of this county where I live, the earliest British people are commemorated. And Bertha married him. Bertha was from the kingdom of the Franks on the other side of the Channel. And it was only permitted for him to marry her on condition that she was able to continue her Christian faith and that she could bring clergy with her who would facilitate that. And so with her came Bishop Ludhard, who acted as her chaplain. And this is the building in which they prayed, even before St. Augustine came. It is perhaps a Roman mausoleum, an impressive Roman tomb building. And some of the other part of the building is of later Anglo-Saxon construction, but this area here in the chancel is the actual area where first Bertha and Ludhard prayed, And then then Augustine and his companion monks and others prayed when they first came to Kent and to Canterbury. And to visit here and place your hand on the sill of these doors, and to think that perhaps St. Augustine, as he bent down, because they're very small doors, as he bent down, put his hand there, is quite moving. And this is the place of worship that has the longest continuous use in the British Isles. It's a very special place, St. Martin's Church, on the outskirts of Canterbury. And of course, you may remember that the reason that Augustine had come in the first place was because it is said that in the slave market in Rome, Pope Gregory the Great, he was the important pope at that time, a very significant figure, a very saintly figure. He saw that there were these fair-haired children for sale in the slave market. And I can perhaps see some of you moving your lips in the words that I will say. You know, he said that they are not Angles, but that's what they were. They were Angles, English. He said, but angels. And so he was moved to have a concern for the people where these children had come from. And as he learned that they had no established Christian faith, they were pagans, he was moved to send a missionary there. And the missionary he settled on was Augustine. And you can imagine that just as some of the Roman centurions didn't exactly enjoy leaving all of the warmth and sunshine of Italy to go to Britain, so you can imagine that a very educated, rather middle-aged abbot from Rome found himself outside of his comfort zone, being sent to preach, not only in another country, but to pagans. And it said that on his journey, he hesitated and wanted to return. And he had to be encouraged by a vision and by Pope Gregory to press on. And these men that accompanied him are to be commended, because they were civilized monks, educated men, and they set off to preach to a wild, terrifying race at the edge of the world. The king of the time was Ethelbert in Kent, and he seems to have been a good man even before he became a Christian. And he was baptized by Augustine, but he insisted that there should be no compulsion in the faith. He understood clearly you had to choose to be a Christian. And although many of his nobles and the population chose to follow him, he never forced anyone to become a Christian. And it seems to me, from what I read of Augustine and his mission, it was a real missionary endeavor, accompanied even with miracles. If you go to one of the monasteries in Canterbury, because not only did he establish a cathedral church, of course, not the great Canterbury Cathedral we see today, but he established a church for himself, he also established not far from it a monastery. And in the remains of the monastery, because it was destroyed at the time of the Protestant Reformation, we can see the remains, the foundations of the first monastic church that was built. And you can see that there are slots in the foundations. And into these slots, the coffins of the various first missionary bishops were placed in the earliest buildings that were erected there. And you can still see in the concrete, because they used concrete in ancient times, you can still see the mark of the coffins, the wood of the coffins. And here, Augustine and Justus and Mellitus and Lawrence were buried. Mellitus became the Bishop of London and faced some opposition. Justus became the Bishop of Rochester, which is about 10 miles away from me in another direction. And Lawrence became the Archbishop, or the Bishop of Canterbury, after the death of Augustine in about 604 AD. There was a pagan reaction to Ethelbert becoming a Christian. And so Mellitus was expelled from London, and he was unable to return in his own lifetime. Justus was expelled from Rochester, although he managed to return. And Bede tells us a story. He says that Lawrence was preparing to join Mellitus and Justus in France. They'd run away to France. And he had a dream in which St. Peter appeared and whipped him as a rebuke for his plans to abandon the mission. And when Lawrence woke up, Bede tells us that he still had whip marks on his body. And he showed these to the new Kentish king who had been driving out the Christian mission. And the Kentish king was converted and recalled the exiled bishops. It's very moving to go to the places associated with these real missionaries, people who truly brought the Christian message to pagans at the risk of their lives even, and certainly outside of their comfort zones. This is what England looked like in about 600 AD. Augustine arrived in 597. And you can see that according to the colors, that the different tribes are represented. There are the Jutes represented here in Kent and in the middle of the south. There are the Saxons in the brown area, the West Saxons, the South Saxons, middle and east. And all of these have become counties in modern England. So this area is called Essex for the East Saxons. This is Middlesex. This is Sussex, the South Saxons, and this is Wessex. We don't have Wessex anymore, but there was a great kingdom of Wessex. I wish we had Wessex. There is some desire to revive some of these ancient kingdoms as we grow dissatisfied with central government. And here the Angles settled in East Anglia, and Lindsey and the Middle Angles, the Mercians. This is where the Angles settled. And here the Britons have been pushed over to the west. By 600 AD, the Britons in the very southwest of England were no longer in land contact with the Britons in Wales. And not so long after this date, the English in their different tribes had pushed over so that the Welsh were also separated from the other Britons in Cumbria. So we can see that in the situation in which Augustine arrives, there isn't just one Anglo-Saxon kingdom, but there are many kingdoms. And we will see that dealing with these kings was an integral part of the Christian mission of Augustine and those who come after him. If we look to the north, we often imagine that Scotland is where the Scots come from. But in actual fact, Northern Ireland is where the Scots come from. And Scotland is named after Irish immigrants who settled in the southwest here of Scotland, what we call Scotland today. All of this white area over here was occupied by people called the Picts. And it's thought that the word Pict has something to do with being painted. And they are those ferocious, painted, woad-covered people that terrified those who lived in more civilized areas. They had no writing, so they've left no literature. They have some stones that have unusual markings and figures on them that aren't easily deciphered. But the Scots themselves came from over in Northern Ireland, and at the closest point between Northern Ireland and Scotland, it's only about 12 miles. So it's very easy to see where Scotland is. It's not as if Scotland was discovered. But at some point before 600 AD, various noblemen in Northern Ireland established colonies in southwest Scotland, and this began to become what we call Scotland. And here, there's a little cross there where my mouse is. That's where Iona is. And it might look as though Iona is at the end of the world, you know, and if you were driving, you do. Often I visit Stirling, which is about here, where the Manau tribe were. And if you drive to Iona, it's a very long drive. And it requires a ferry several ferry crossings. But if you're traveling by boat, Iona is actually easy to get to. It's on various sea routes. The people traveling around here were used to traveling in boats, used to trading in boats. And so actually this was not an isolated Scottish community. It was a community connected by the sea to the wider Irish community and civilization at the beginning. It was only later on that the royal families of the Scots married into the royal family of the Picts, and the whole area became united and eventually became Scotland. And so I'm going to begin with pictures looking at not somewhere in the south where we started in St. Martin's Church, but Iona, the place that many of us want to visit. It's not perhaps what we expect always. You know, when I visited, it was a little too busy for me. I expected it to be more remote. I expected it to be to have a greater sense of sanctity about it. But actually, it was filled with day trippers. And in the next slide, I'll tell you about something when I was there. These buildings were the ancient medieval abbey. The abbey church remained in a state of some disrepair, but still usable. But all of the complex of buildings from the medieval abbey had fallen into disrepair and ruin. And they were rebuilt by George MacLeod and the Iona community in 1938, in the 1930s. So what we see today is a very impressive modern rebuilding of the medieval abbey complex. There are older buildings on the site, and this is where Columba established his monastic center, and he lived in 521 and he died in 597. So Columba dies in the year that Augustine arrives in Kent. And Iona is established in about 563 AD. And Iona very quickly becomes a center of learning and spirituality, a center of missionary activity, deliberate missionary activity, and also one of political diplomacy and integration. And we're going to see this in many of the places we look at briefly this evening. The land for Iona was given by a king, given by a Scottish king, a relative of Columba, certainly. But the monastery land depended on the king. He was given that land and asked to settle there and encouraged to settle there. And the relationship between the monastery and the royalty, between the abbot and the king, was an important one. It was important for Columba, and it allowed him to travel over a wide area in missionary engagement, but it also allowed him to be used by the various royal families in diplomacy. Where it was very difficult for one warrior king to go to the court of another warrior king, it was very risky. You could be taken and killed. It became possible and frequent that an abbot of the stature of Columba, a member of the royal family, someone with some social standing, but certainly someone with some spiritual standing, would go and act as a go-between, as a diplomat between the various kingdoms. And this was how Columba often acted. We do have a life of Columba written by Adomnan, just the generation afterwards. And Adomnan, who became abbot of Iona, he spoke to some of those who had known Columba personally. And it's a very interesting life. It's filled with miracles and prophecies and visions, but it is written very closely to the time of Columba. It's not one of those lives of the saints written 500 years afterwards. And he was speaking to people, and he was the abbot of Iona just decades after Columba. So there was something special about Columba. From my own position as an Orthodox priest, I see him as a miraculous, grace-filled, Holy Spirit-empowered missionary. But more than that, he establishes Iona as a center of learning. And this is another aspect that we will look at through this evening. It's a place where the wider kingdom around him looked to have their children educated, looked to have those who could read and write, looked to see those who had a connection with the wider European world. And this was one of the important functions of the monasteries in this period. This is another picture of Iona, and this is the hill of the abbot, Tor and Abba. And it's remarkable to think that St. Columba's simple cell was on top of this little mound. And archaeology has been done. And definitely this is where there was a cell. And this is where Columba's cell is marked out. And archaeologists have suggested that there was a low wall surrounding the top of this small mound, and that the roof of Columba's cell would have been made of wood and turf and thatch. But again, to visit this place is to have a personal, physical connection with St. Columba from 1500 years ago. But this mound represents more what the monastery in his time would have been like. There would have been a surrounding wall or palisade. There would have been his own cell on top of this mound, and there would have been many other cells of the monks gathered around. It would have had some similarity to a monastery in Egypt, apart from the fact in Egypt it never rains, and here on Iona the sun hardly ever shines, you know. But apart from the weather, the routine and the layout and the relationship of the monks to each other would have been very similar to the Egyptian experience. And again, it's precious and valuable and inspiring to visit this place. On the other side of the country, and Ilya mentioned that he's visited here, on the other side of the country is Lindisfarne. And Lindisfarne is in Northumbria. And this was a monastery established by Aidan. Aidan had been a monk at Iona. He was an Irishman. He was trained in his monasticism in this Columban context and environment. And he was invited to come and establish a monastery on Lindisfarne, which has become over the years known as Holy Island. And just to the far right of the picture, you can see that there is a medieval castle on that hill. And here in the main layer of the picture, you can see the medieval monastery ruins. Again, the monastery of the time of Aidan and then Cuthbert comes later, is much simpler and is buried under much of this later development. And just as Iona was actually close to the royal centre in the west of Scotland, so Lindisfarne is very close to the royal centre at Bamberg, which is literally 5 or 6 miles down the coast. Bamberg has been from ancient times an important royal settlement of the Anglo-Saxon settlers who came to this area. And so again, Lindisfarne is given by a king. It's not chosen so much by a monk as if he might go into the desert and find somewhere utterly remote. It's a monastery which is established in a relationship with the local royal center of power. And it provides services, we can say, to the local royal community, just as the royal community provides support and encouragement and patronage to the monastery. It's far enough away, just as Iona is, to be separate, but it's close enough to be of mutual use to the king and to the royal settlement. Lindisfarne is a tidal island, again, well worth a visit if you ever come to the British Isles. It's connected now by a causeway to the mainland. It was a pilgrim center for hundreds of years. And after Aidan had established this monastery, Cuthbert became the bishop and abbot. And Cuthbert becomes someone who's very important in the history of Christianity in the northern part of Britain. But this connection between Iona and Ireland and Lindisfarne is important. Just as Augustine is busy in the south of England, establishing Christianity among the tribes there, so we see that in the north, it's the Irish Ionan influence which is coming across from the west into the east. And a little later on, they come into some conflict or some tension. But at the beginning, we see that there is a missionary endeavor towards the pagan British peoples. The Welsh are criticized for doing nothing in terms of evangelism. And to be fair, although that criticism is true, it had only been 150 years since the pagan Angles and Saxons had begun to invade England. And for many of the Welsh, warfare was still something very fresh in their minds and memories. But we can see that in the north and west, and in the south and the east, there are genuine missionary efforts to convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons. Cuthbert became bishop of Lindisfarne, and he lived between 635 and 687. So he was born about the beginning of Lindisfarne's establishment, and he died a generation afterwards. He lived on Lindisfarne and served in other places, but further away from Lindisfarne, there are a series of small islands called the Farn Islands. You can see them if you stand on the coast or if you are standing on Lindisfarne. He chose one of these, Inner Farn, as a place for his own personal spiritual retreat. And here we see that there is a small church or chapel, and it's built over the place of his cell, the place where he would go for long periods of prayer and retreat and fasting. And you have to get a boat out there. It depends on the weather conditions. But again, to travel out to this island, especially with only a handful of people, is to experience something of what it would have been like for Cuthbert when he was there. He also had another cell on a very small island that's within walking distance of Lindisfarne. When the tide goes out, you can walk across the rocks to St. Cuthbert's Isle, which is no more than the size of a house in extent. And there you can see just about in the grass, it's been excavated, but just in the grass, you can see the traces of where his small, simple cell would have been. And you can sit there quietly and feel yourself sitting outside the very cell of St. Cuthbert, which is, again, something inspiring and awesome, really. What was Lindisfarne like? Most of the buildings were made of wood. From one perspective, it was a very simple place and very little remains. And yet the Lindisfarne Gospels were produced on this island, while nearly all of the buildings were made of wood. We often have the impression that those who lived a long time ago weren't capable of doing very much. But when we look at the great cathedrals, and here, when we look at a manuscript like this has not been produced on a computer. This has not been produced by cutting and pasting various designs to make sure that everything looks exactly the same. Someone sat here and produced this set of the four Gospels, one of the treasures of the Western world. And current scholarship indicates that it was produced about 715. And it was the work of almost a single monk, Eadfrith, who became bishop in Lindisfarne in 698. And it's believed that the Gospels were produced in honor of St. Cuthbert. St. Cuthbert was already a very important saint. On his death, really, he became an important figure. And it seems that some passages, some sections of this manuscript are incomplete. And therefore it seems that Eadfrith was still working on it when he died in 721. We should say a little bit about Lindisfarne, because it doesn't have a continuous history. But due to Viking raids, the monastic community had to leave Lindisfarne in 875. Can you imagine being in a monastery and completely unexpectedly the Vikings arrive? You know, it was utterly terrifying because all of the monastic communities were isolated, were undefendable. And none of them were places that could protect themselves against the Viking onslaught. And so when the Vikings first invaded and came to Lindisfarne, they killed many of the monks. It must have seemed a terrifying thing because you could never be sure when they would return, and they did return. And they attacked many other monasteries up and down the northeast coast. So in 875, the community left Lindisfarne and they took with them Cuthbert's body, his relics, many of the books, including the Lindisfarne Gospels, and a book that is called the St. Cuthbert Gospel, which we'll look at in a minute. And so the monks carried this precious cargo with them. There is a cave just on the mainland, away from Lindisfarne, called St. Cuthbert's Cave, another place where the monks would go for retreat. And that was the first place where they hid when the Vikings came. And then they traveled until they settled in a place called Chester Street. And they stayed there for almost a century, really, with the remains of Cuthbert, with the Lindisfarne Gospels, with many other relics and books from the monastery. And eventually they moved and they settled in Durham, another place that Ilya mentioned. And the reason that Durham is there, the reason that Durham Cathedral is there, is because the monastic family or community of Lindisfarne, after their 100-year journey with the relics of the saints, they finally settled at Durham on the top of the great hill there. Again, if you visit England, you should try to visit Durham, one of the great Christian sites in the country. But how is it possible that a community living in wooden huts is able to produce something as spectacular as the Lindisfarne Gospels? But in fact, there was a scriptorium or a place of producing writings on Lindisfarne. And it's thought that it took perhaps 10 years to produce what we see in the Lindisfarne Gospels. Its pages aren't made of paper, of course, but of vellum, which is calf skin. Imagine taking the skin of a calf and treating it so that it becomes supple, perfectly clean, almost translucent. And it's estimated it took the skin of 150 calves to make this gospel book. The book is 516 pages long, and the pens would have been quills cut from either reeds or from the feathers of geese or other birds like that. Eadfrith, the bishop and abbot who produced much of this text himself, manufactured his own colours. There was no shop he could go to buy different colours. There was no Amazon. He manufactured them all himself using different types of rocks and soil and minerals and herbs and ferns to produce something as beautiful as this. And the amazing thing is that it's still so colourful as we see here. The colours haven't faded. And it's another miracle that it's been preserved. Another book produced at roughly the same time, under the influence of the monastery of Iona, is a book that's called the Book of Kells. And Kells is a monastery in Ireland, in County Meath, and it had been founded by monks from Iona. So this is a book produced by the monks around the monastery of Iona. The Lindisfarne Gospels are produced by monks on the east coast. This volume, the Book of Kells, is produced by monks on the west coast and in Ireland. And it's thought that this book was produced to celebrate an anniversary of St. Columba's death. And we know that it was probably written partly in Iona, partly in the monastery of Kells, and it was probably completed by about 800. So this is a little bit later than the Lindisfarne Gospels, but you can see again how detailed this is. One of the Gospel pages, one of the pages introducing one of the Gospels. And you can see that the artwork has a certain local flavor about it. But also you can see how densely decorated it is, how competent the artistry is. This is one of the best things that was produced during this period. And again, it's remarkable that it has survived into the present times and can be seen, just as the Lindisfarne Gospels can be seen. So this period was one of increasing cultural significance, cultural development. It was a time in which Christianity was seen to be something represented by artifacts like this. And you can imagine a pagan king seeing a book, and not only a book, but a book with such decoration, would be impressed by what Christianity was able to produce. And this is some of the best work that we see from this period in the British Isles. And it's associated with this period after Augustine. St. Cuthbert, as we have said, was the Bishop of Lindisfarne and other places. He was a missionary bishop. Again, all of these bishops were concerned with mission and with sharing the Christian faith. And as I said, when the Vikings invaded, his coffin, his body was taken away for safety, and it remained on the move for quite a long while until it was finally settled at Durham. Just 10 years or 11 years after his death, his coffin was opened and it was discovered that his body was incorrupt. His body had not decomposed in any way. And so very quickly, his reputation as a great saint became shared and became present, not only in the Northeast, but throughout Britain. Numerous miracles were associated with his intercession. And so people wanted to travel to venerate his relics. And from the very beginning, things associated with him became a matter of pilgrimage. When his coffin was finally taken to Durham, he was first placed in a church that was built there by the monks, a stone church. But obviously Durham Cathedral now is a much later building. There is still the place where he is buried. If you go to Durham Cathedral, there is, in the place where his shrine was, a slab on the floor that says St. Cuthbert, St. Cuthbertus. And his holy remains are buried there. Despite the fact that in the Protestant Reformation, his shrine was smashed to pieces and dispersed, nevertheless, his sanctity was of such a great degree that they left his remains in peace and buried him in the place where he still is. It's wonderful to go to Durham Cathedral and to sit before his grave, before his tomb, and as an Orthodox priest to ask for his intercessions. Also in Durham Cathedral, as we'll see in a minute, St. Bede is buried there. And as we read so much of Bede's History of the English Peoples, a book I recommend to you all, it's wonderful to go and pray as an Orthodox priest before his own tomb in Durham Cathedral. His tomb, Cuthbert's tomb, was opened several times. People didn't really leave him to rest in peace. And within his tomb, within his grave, within his coffin, and you can see these things in the museum on the site. First of all, there was the cross on the left-hand side, a pectoral cross that he would have worn, the sign of him being a bishop and an abbot. And that was found on his body in his coffin. And also there is a stole. The stole is the cloth which goes around the neck of a bishop. And this was a gift from King Athelstan, who came to visit him on pilgrimage. This is actually a Byzantine stole. It's produced of silk. It's again one of the great works that has come down to us. It shows that not only were they able to write and draw, but they could produce things in cloth as well. And this was the great gift that King Athelstan brought of embroidery to be placed inside the tomb of Cuthbert in 927 when he came on a pilgrimage. Fortunately, Cuthbert retained his importance. Other shrines were destroyed and the relics of the saints were thrown out or dispersed. But Durham is a wonderful place because we can still actually find ourselves in the presence of the bodily remains of Cuthbert and Bede. This is another wonderful treasure which was found inside his coffin, his tomb. It's the St. Cuthbert Gospel. And look how beautiful that handwriting is. Who wouldn't wish to be able to write with such a hand? I'm so used to using a computer now that I can hardly read my own handwriting. But look how beautiful that is. And I saw online yesterday that someone is producing a facsimile of this. This is the earliest book that we have in the West in its original binding. It has wooden covers and binding. And it's the oldest book of this form to have survived. It contains the Gospel of St. John, written in Latin, and it was thought for a while that it was his own gospel. But now it's considered that it was written perhaps 10 years after his death by the monks Lindisfarne to be placed on his chest in his tomb. And so it seems unlikely it was his own gospel, but it's a beautiful little book. It's 5 inches high and it's 3 inches wide, so it's a tiny little gospel. And it was produced as a tribute to honor St. Cuthbert, that he might have it in his tomb. In actual fact, when his body and his relics were taken away from Lindisfarne to escape the Vikings, and when they were settled at Chester-le-Street and then Durham, it appears that if you were important enough, they had this little book in a leather bag, and you could wear it around your neck while you participated in prayers in the church. It was considered that valuable. At the dissolution of the monasteries, when the shrines throughout Britain were destroyed, the book passed to some collectors. It passed into secular hands. And fortunately, it was eventually given to a Roman Catholic Jesuit school in Lancashire, Stonyhurst College. And so sometimes it's called the Stonyhurst Gospel. But again, thank God that something so unique, this isn't one of an edition of 1,000 that's been preserved. This is the exact book that was produced on Lindisfarne in wooden huts, by men working under the light of candles and rush lamps. They produced something with handwriting as utterly exquisite as this, and it has been preserved to our own time. And then I want to speak again. Now, Ilya also mentioned Jarrow. We want to speak for a moment about Bede and Jarrow. Much of what we know about the history of Christianity in Britain during this period is taken from the book by Bede called The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. And you can buy that book from Amazon, and it's a wonderful book, and I recommend it. I recommend it to anyone who wants to understand the early history of Christianity in England, written by a man who was part of that history. We've already seen that Bede was part of this chain of Aidan and then Cuthbert and then Bede. They were men who were living in the same northeastern collection of monasteries. And here is the monastery where Bede lived. The monastery was founded in 674, and again, it was founded on land given by a king. When a king became a Christian, he wanted to have a monastery near his throne, near his royal center, because the monastery provided education, learning, spirituality, mission, as well as diplomatic and political services, we can say. And this house, this monastery, was founded by a man called Benedict Biscop. And Benedict Biscop is an important person because he came from Italy. He was rooted in the Roman traditions. And when he came to this place at the very edge of the world, he wanted and he was able to introduce Roman Christian civilization, we can say. So for the first time among the English, he brought stonemasons to build a stone church, not a wooden church, but a stone church. More than that, he built men who could make glass. There had been no tradition of glass among the English. The Romans had glass, but the English didn't have. And so he brought glass makers. He brought singers to teach the local community, especially the monks, to sing in the Roman style. And so he was seeking to establish a model monastery to show how other monasteries in England could be developed and operated. He even managed to bring the cantor, the choir master from Rome, to come and give lessons and to help the monks here in Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow to sing properly. So in the middle of this English kingdom, influenced by the Irish tradition, we find that there are monks who have learnt to sing as they are singing in Rome. And there is a building made of stone, which would be seen on the continent. And there is glass in the windows. And we can see that the monastic influence here is beginning to influence much more. It's beginning to influence how the king thinks about building, how the king thinks about learning and living. And so much of the development of civilization in this period in the British Isles is rooted in the introduction, the reintroduction of civilization, we can say, through the monastic vector. And Benedict Biscop was the abbot of this monastery at Monk Wearmouth. And it was such a successful monastery that the king gave additional land so a second monastery could be built at a place called Jarrow. And these were about 6 or 7 miles apart, and they considered themselves one monastery. And Bede entered the monastery when he was 7 years old. He was probably from a noble or well-to-do family, and essentially he never left the monastery again. And yet he became, probably in the 100 years or the 200 years of his life period, he became the most important scholar in Western civilization. Not only had Benedict Biscop brought stonemasons, glass makers, and singers, but he had brought a large library with him of books which he had collected on the continent. And so Bede became perhaps the most educated man of his time. We know that he wrote about 60 books, many of which have come down to us. He was interested in the calendar. He was interested in writing textbooks for education, because you have to remember that there were many youths and children in the monastery. The kings and the nobles increasingly wanted their children to gain an education. And so he wrote textbooks, but he wrote biblical commentary as well. We can read his commentary on the Bible. And especially he wrote the famous ecclesiastical history of the English people. And in actual fact, this book was so important, even in his own time. There are so many copies of it. It was already so popular that the monasteries where he lived developed a special minuscule, small way of writing. They didn't want to take hours drawing large letters because they had so many copies of this book to produce. The demand was so high. So these two monasteries developed their own way of writing in a very small hand called minuscule, so that they could produce as many of the manuscripts of the ecclesiastical history as possible. And the ecclesiastical history begins with a rather legendary, mythical introduction of the British people, but Bede had been in contact with people in Canterbury. Bede had been in contact with people as far as he could, so that the writings he was putting in his book were based on evidence. He tried to avoid legend as far as possible, and he tried to write from documentary evidence which he had produced in his own studies. We find in Bede's book some letters that Augustine had written to Pope Gregory. He had questions to ask. He had found himself in Britain, and he wanted to ask questions, and Pope Gregory writes responses to his questions. And we find these letters in Bede's text, the Ecclesiastical History. Where did Bede find them? He found them in Canterbury, in the library in Canterbury, where he was engaged in correspondence with the abbot there, because these were letters that came to the Archbishop of Canterbury and entered the documentary store, such as it was in Canterbury. He was dealing with historical research as far as he was able. And he becomes really the father of history, not only church history, in the British Isles. And in this book, the Ecclesiastical History, he deals with the mission of Augustine. He deals with the introduction of Christianity into his own area of Northumbria. He deals with many of the deaths of godly kings at the hands of pagans. And he brings it right up to his own time in the late 7th century. It's a book that's well worth reading. Here we see the chancel, the altar area of the church in Jarrow. And this is Anglo-Saxon. The windows are medieval. The windows wouldn't have been like that in Anglo-Saxon times. But the fabric of the church is Anglo-Saxon. Saint Bede sat in this building. Saint Bede sat here. From the years when he was 7 as a child to when he died, he hardly left his monastery. And to sit in this chancel is to sit in the same place that St. Bede sat over and over again. Again, there is a real physical contact for us in the British Isles when we go to these holy places. And the monasteries of Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow produced their own documents, their own manuscripts. And here you see, this is a very large book indeed. This is a whole Bible. It's a giant single volume edition of the Bible, the Vulgate version in Latin, the Latin Common Version. And 3 of these Bibles were produced in the monasteries of Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow. And it's been estimated that it took 2,000 cattle, 2,000 cows to produce all of the vellum required for these 3 huge volumes of the Bible. In fact, it required the king to give land to support these cows. It again required the involvement of the royal power to facilitate the work of the church. The work of the church was to be this department of learning, study, spirituality. One of these volumes was to be at Jarrow. One of them was to be at Monk Wearmouth. And they were to be the Bibles, the precious Bibles that would be used in these monasteries. Of these, almost all trace has gone. All trace of one has gone, a few fragments of another remain. But this volume, and I think this is a facsimile, but this volume has been preserved entirely. And in actual fact, it was written to be given as a gift to the Pope, to Pope Gregory II in 716 AD. And at the front of it, there is a dedication to him. And it was intended that the abbot of Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow Monastery would set off to Rome with some companions and would present the Pope with this very, very precious gift, a priceless gift. The abbot of the time was Cuthbert, and he began it when he took over as abbot in 692. And so, again, it took 10 or 15 years to produce this gift for the Pope. Unfortunately, he died on the way to Rome. And the manuscript found its way through various places, but it found itself eventually in a library where it was preserved. And so of these 3 volumes that were produced in 716 AD, one of them remains still. Again, you can see how the writing is so very small and clear and neat. It's not so highly decorated. It's a working tool. It's intended to be the scriptures to be read in these churches. Again, we can see the learning, the skills required and gathered together in one place in a monastery to be able to produce something like this. Not only knowledge of the scriptures, the monastery would have to have copies of the scriptures. It would have to have those who could read Latin and understand Latin and write Latin. It would have to have those who could produce vellum. It would have to have those who could produce inks and do the binding. It required a large group of ancillary craftsmen around the production of a manuscript such as this, beyond just the monks. And then we come to Theodore of Tarsus. And when I was baptized into Orthodoxy, I actually took the name Theodore after Theodore of Tarsus. And why have I called him Theodore of Tarsus? Sometimes he's known as Theodore of Canterbury. I want it to be clear that he comes from the Middle East. He comes from Tarsus. And he grew up there. And until his 30s, that's where he was a Christian and a monk. And he was driven out of Tarsus in the Middle East with the Muslim invasions, and he found his way eventually to Rome, where he entered into one of the monasteries in Rome. He studied in Rome, and he came to the notice of the Pope. And at one point, one lucky point, we can say, certainly one providential point, one of the archbishops of Canterbury had set off to Rome to receive the blessing of the Pope. And this seemed to happen rather a lot. Maybe it was a difficult journey in those days, but he died. He died while he was traveling to Rome and while he was in Rome. And so the Pope decided, I'm going to send someone in his place. And he looked around, and Theodore was 66 by then. He had a reputation as a scholar. And when Wighard, the candidate, had died, Pope Vitalian decided that he would send Theodore in his place. And he was recommended by Hadrian, one of the abbots of the monasteries in Rome. And so Vitalian sent Theodore and had consecrated him as Archbishop of Canterbury. And he also sent Hadrian with him because he wasn't quite sure that this man from the East wouldn't introduce some funny ideas. So he sent Hadrian with him to make sure that none of these strange Eastern ways were introduced. But here, this is a remarkable thing, I think, that a man from the Middle East becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury in the middle of the 7th century. And really, the English church, such as we have it, depends on St. Theodore's reforms, St. Theodore's introduction of order. When he came to England, he discovered that many of the sees were vacant. Every kingdom wanted their own bishop. There was no idea that one bishop might be responsible for 2 kingdoms. So every king wanted his own bishop. And there were many bishops vacant, many bishoprics vacant. And so when he came, he had to reorganize the English church. It had grown up in a piecemeal pattern as different kings had become Christian. And it was really under his influence that for the first time we have the beginnings really of an English church. He started to hold councils at which bishops from all the different kingdoms came. He issued instructions. We have a penitential written by him, filled with spiritual advice. He wrote about the calendar. He was a very educated man. And we shouldn't underestimate the value of educated monks and missionaries in the English church at this time. And so when he came to Canterbury, he formed a school with Hadrian. And this school taught Greek and Latin. Scholars came. The youths of various noble families would be educated. There was a golden age of Anglo-Saxon scholarship at this time, because for the first time there was this real connection with continental and Eastern academia, we could say, even, because he wasn't just a monk, he was a scholar. And Hadrian also was a scholar. And especially with his own background in the East, he brought a flavor to the school which he established in Canterbury. And we read that he taught sacred music there. He introduced knowledge of some of the Eastern saints. It's thought that he may have introduced the litany of the saints from the East into the West. He wrote biblical commentaries, many of which have come down to us. And as I said, he was very interested in the calendar and in Easter. And he was very concerned with the discipline of the church, even when it produced some discord. He felt that the vast diocese of the Northeast, which Wilfrid had inherited, was too big for one man. And really, it did occupy 2 huge kingdoms. And so he wanted to divide it. And Wilfrid objected to this. And there was a disagreement. And Wilfrid went off to Rome to plead his case. And when he came back, he discovered that Theodore had divided it in any case. But he was concerned always with what is necessary for good order in the church. So at the beginning of our period, we saw that there was a great missionary impetus, and the monks and monasteries were valued for their educational and other usefulness, but they were missionaries from Iona, from Canterbury. They were setting out to convert the Angles and Saxons. And they relied everywhere on the encouragement and the participation of kings and royal families. But now, at the time of Theodore, we start to see a church which is organizing itself across the boundaries of various kingdoms and is the foundation of a really English church, which is why I took his name, I find him very inspiring. I have an icon of him, but this isn't my icon. To read his writings, to read all of the writings of these ancient scholars, such as Bede, is to properly find ourselves inspired by them and in awe of their abilities. If we are doing research ourselves, we can search on Google and we can find ourselves at least finding the names of hundreds of books that we might want to read. But imagine how hard it was to become truly educated in these ages. And yet men such as Bede and Theodore did. The photo on the left is one I took myself. He's buried in the ruins of the monastery in Canterbury, where we saw the marks of some of those early bishops. And simply on the grass in the middle of the church, the ruins of the church was utterly destroyed. You see this slab that marks where he is buried. Archbishop Theodore died 690. And in the sunny weather, I like to go there and visit and sit there. No one else knows or cares, but this is where St. Theodore is buried. That's precious to me. Again, how fortunate it's only 18 miles away from me. And then at the same time, we see another development. And perhaps some of you have heard of Caedmon. Much of Christianity was being communicated in Latin, of course. Latin was the lingua franca. It was the language that everyone spoke, just as in the Middle East, for a long while, Greek was the language that everyone spoke. And so those who spoke English had less access to the resources of Christianity. And Caedmon, according to Bede, was an illiterate cowherder. I was going to say a shepherd of cows. He was a cowherder, and he couldn't read Latin. And Bede tells us the story of what happened. He says that Caedmon had left a feast when they were passing a harp around for everyone to sing a song. And he left the hall because he felt ashamed that he couldn't contribute a song to this celebration. And it's said that later that night in a dream, a man appeared to him and asked him to sing a song. And Caedmon responded and said that he could not sing. He couldn't speak any Latin. He couldn't sing any of the hymns of the church, for instance. And the man who appeared to him told him, "Sing to me the beginning of all things." And Caedmon was then able to sing verses and words that he had not heard or thought of before in the English language. That's the remarkable thing. And Caedmon then reported his experience to his boss, his manager, in the ordinary practical arrangements of the monastery at Whitby, where he was. And the manager reported what had happened to Hilda, the abbess of Whitby. And she called him before her and asked him to repeat the words. And she gave him other stories from the scriptures in English and asked him to compose poems. And the remarkable thing about Caedmon, firstly, that he was a simple man, but this is the first development of Christian poetry, we can say, in the English language. It's the first time that the transition is made from a purely Latin experience of Christianity, even in the Roman period, to one which is rooted in the language of the invading Angles and Saxons. And of course, the Anglo-Saxon tradition was of singing, of reciting things from memory. And so this reciting of the wonders of God in English fitted into the English culture. Where before they had recited poems such as Beowulf, now they would recite in English, a paraphrase, a record of all of God's wonders. And the words are recorded for us in Bede's ecclesiastical history, along with an account of what happened. This wonderful treasure, and we can only look at a few things. This wonderful treasure is called the Alfred Jewel. Again, how are these things discovered outside of the providence of God, The Alfred Jewel, you can see it's a beautiful piece made of gold and enamel. And it was discovered in 1693. It's a miracle that having been discovered in 1693, it wasn't stolen or broken in the years since then. And it dates to the reign of Alfred the Great. On it, around the outside, it says, Alfred had me made, in English. Alfred ordered me made. And it's believed that it was attached to a rod, a stick, and it was intended to be a device to be used while you were reading, while someone was reading the Bible or something. And it's thought that these were made and gifted to various monasteries at the same time that he had arranged for Pope Gregory the Great's book, Pastoral Care, to be translated into English. Again, Alfred the Great was truly a great king. He was a scholar himself. He had been through this monastic regime, and he valued a book such as Pope Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, a book that probably most of us haven't read. But more than valuing it, he had copies made to be distributed to the clergy in his kingdom so that they might be improved in their ministry. And along with each book, he had one of these jewels made with a rod. And we read in the preface to the book that was given, I will send a copy to every bishop's see in my kingdom, and in each book there is a pointer, and I command in God's name that no man take the pointer from the book, nor the book from the church. So even in that time, there was a problem with people borrowing books and not returning them. But here, at some point, this pointer had got detached from the book in the hundreds of years between its production and its finding, and it was lost in the mud and it was rediscovered. This tells us something important about the relationship of royalty with monasticism and Christianity, that there was this positive and fruitful relationship so that you actually end up with an educated and godly king. And it also shows us how much the king values education. The king is in fact promoting education within the monasteries. This was a fruitful period of cooperation and synergy. And then we come to one of the last figures that we'll speak about, who is Dunstan. And Dunstan represents the final development in this relationship between monasticism and royalty, politics, and a development of spirituality in an increasingly Christian England, and in a country that considers itself now to be England and not a variety of kingdoms. Dunstan was born in about 909 AD and died in 988 AD. So he is at the very end of our period. He had a very mixed and varied career. He was abbot of Glastonbury Abbey. He was Bishop of Worcester. He was Bishop of London, and he was Archbishop of Canterbury. And he became canonized as a saint very early on. There was a great degree of respect for what he did for the church. And again, rather like Theodore, he took a church which had rather fallen into laxity and casualness about so many things, and he reformed it at every level. He was actually a silversmith, and he worked in the scriptorium in Glastonbury. And we find that many of these English bishops actually had some sort of craft ability. They weren't just professional religious people, but having been brought up in a monastery, they often were creative. And again, I think there's something important in all of these things we've seen, that the creative element of Christianity remains. This isn't a Christianity only of the head, but it's a Christianity of beautiful things that are made by people that are growing into unity with a creative God. And so Dunstan was a silversmith. He made things with his hands out of silver. And this picture here is from a manuscript from Glastonbury Abbey. And it's thought that Dunstan himself drew this and drew himself there on the right-hand side, kneeling down before Christ. It is said that this church remains on the left. This is in Glastonbury Abbey. This would have been the small church, the smaller church that was known to Dunstan when he was there. The rest of the remains of Glastonbury Abbey are much later. But the remains here are the associated remains of the church, the chapel, that Dunstan would have known. And Dunstan became one of those bishops who became very useful to the king. Undoubtedly, he was a godly man. Undoubtedly, he was a spiritual man. But essentially he became the king's right-hand man. He became Joseph to Pharaoh, we can say. Here is Glastonbury Abbey. When he became the abbot here, Glastonbury had rather fallen into ruin. None of those buildings were there, of course. They're all very much later. There were some Irish monks living here at Glastonbury. And perhaps you know that Glastonbury is an island on a marshy area. And again, we see many monasteries built on islands. When he became abbot of Glastonbury, he recreated monastic life. He introduced the Benedictine rule. He built new buildings, and he reorganized and reordered the monastic life so that people were living according to a rule. He went to Rome in 960, and on his journey there, it said that he gave away all of the wealth that he had brought with him to provide for the travel, and he insisted to those who traveled with him that they would trust in Jesus Christ to provide for all that they needed. We read that during his life, I'll just read a quote from a historian, monasteries were built, and in some of the great cathedrals, monks took the place of secular canons, and in the rest, the canons were obliged to live according to rule. The parish priests were compelled to be qualified for their office. You would think that that was normal, but at this time, it wasn't normal that parish priests were qualified. Maybe that's still a problem with us today. They were urged to teach parishioners not only the truths of the Christian faith, but also trades to improve their position. The state saw reforms as well. Good order was maintained throughout the realm, and there was respect for the law. Trained bands policed the north, and a navy guarded the shore from Viking raids. There was a level of peace in the kingdom unknown in living memory. And in 973, Dunstan's political career, and I don't think we can consider him a politician, but that was his value to the king, it reached its zenith when he officiated at the coronation of King Edgar. So we have now English kings, not kings of different kingdoms, but we have a king of the English and a church of the English. And aspects of the coronation rite, which Dunstan created, are still used in the coronation of British monarchs. He was very important, and in the last days of his life, he fell into conflict with one of the kings, and he retired to his monastery where he died. One of the legends about him is that he was working on something in silver, and the devil came to tempt him, and he grabbed hold of the devil's nose with his metal pliers, grips, and he wouldn't let the devil go until he had done what he wanted. And those pliers are found in a Roman Catholic convent not too far from me. They certainly appear to be of Anglo-Saxon origin. Whether they are the ones that actually grasped Satan's nose, I don't know. And then we'll just look at a few churches. Towards the end of this period, we're starting to see the churches settled everywhere. Bishops and monks can be high statesmen. They're valued by royalty. But it doesn't seem to me that they have entirely forgotten their spiritual and missionary calling. In actual fact, they bring order and discipline to the nation, both spiritually and politically. They really do enter into a synergy with the executive arm that is fruitful to both. Here is Brixworth, a church in Northamptonshire. And again, this might be the church that Ilya visited. It's a building built from the 7th century, and it's almost entirely from the 7th century. And it was the largest building north of the Alps. Imagine that everyone for 100 miles around is living in a wooden shack, you know. This was a vast building as far as they were concerned. And it remains substantially as it was when it was built. There was a monastery here in 675, and this church started to be built in the 7th century. There are some later additions from the 10th century. The tower, the square tower, the top of it is from the 14th century. But essentially, this building is from the 7th century. And it shows how, even in a relatively early period, the Christian church was able to introduce craft, aspects of culture, built culture that were unknown to the English. And they were an important vector for introducing stone building into the English kingdoms. Then we also see at Ripon, again, stone buildings. Wilfrid had a troubled career. I highly value him, to be honest. Wherever Wilfrid went, he ended up doing missionary work. And he ended up for some years on the south coast of England, and rather than just sit there moaning, he evangelized the whole area. And at one point, he found himself returning to the monastery at Ripon that he had founded. He did get into arguments with kings and with archbishops. But here at Ripon, the cathedral itself you can visit is of a later medieval period, but down some stairs there is this crypt, a small crypt from the Anglo-Saxon monastery church, which Wilfrid knew himself. And here he would have kept the most precious relics of the saints, other valuables, and this remains underneath the later medieval building. When I last went there, because of COVID restrictions, we weren't allowed to go down the stairs to it. But Wilfrid was here in this place. To touch these walls is to touch the walls that Wilfrid himself touched. And we see that at his time and under his influence and others, stone buildings are being created, duplicating those which are found elsewhere in Western Europe at the time. And again, Wilfrid at Hexham. Ilya mentioned Hexham. Hexham is another monastery associated with Wilfrid. And here at Hexham, we have the Frith stool. This was the bishop's stool that Wilfrid sat upon when he was bishop and abbot here. He sat on this stool. And it has the name of the Frith stool because it came to be associated with sanctuary, with those who were fleeing from some sort of trouble were able to come here and find sanctuary while their problem was dealt with. And they were not to be harassed or violently treated while they were here. But here in the middle of Hexham Abbey is the Frith stool, which Wilfrid sat upon. And we can see several things here. It's from the 7th century, but we can see that it has a connection with the continent. It has a connection with the idea of government and authority. It has something of a throne about it, not a grandiloquent throne, not something over the top, but it has the sense of a place where someone is seated with authority, a governor, someone with some social and political standing. And it's inherited from the Roman tradition that Wilfrid and others are connecting themselves to. They are seeking to establish a church in England, which is not completely new, but is rooted in the Western and the Roman. I don't necessarily mean Roman Catholic, but the Western and Roman Christian tradition. And again, you can go here and you can touch this. I haven't seen anyone sit on it. I don't know if they'd move you on if you sat on it, but you can touch the throne that Wilfrid sat on. And then here, this is another small little church, St. Peter on the Wall. And according to Bede, there was a city or a settlement nearby called Ithenchester. And the chapel of St. Peter on the Wall was built by Bishop Ched in 654. Ched had a brother called Chad, and they're often confused. Chad is the bishop responsible for missionary work in the northwest of England, where I serve. Ched was very active in the east of England. And this building was established by him. He was another one of those monks associated with Lindisfarne, and yet here he is 200 or 300 miles away from Lindisfarne doing missionary work. These were real missionaries. They weren't people stuck in an ivory tower, They were people who were concerned to share the Christian faith with the pagan English peoples wherever they found them. This building has as you can imagine, a varied history. Until 1442, it was still being used as a chapel. And it had been expanded slightly. They didn't know at the time how old it was, but it is actually from the 7th century. But then after the Protestant Reformation, it became a barn, and I think round the other, no, at the back here, you can see the outline of the barn door where carts would have been rolled in. So it became a barn for hundreds of years until it was identified as a church again, and in 1920 it was restored and reconsecrated as a chapel, and Christian services take place here. But this building is 1,300 years old, and represents something significant in this landscape where everything else would have been made of wood. Here was a building to worship God made of stone, and that must have been something that made an impression. But also, here is a man who has come hundreds of miles to share the Christian faith in a real missionary spirit, which drove the church at this time until everyone became Christian in England in one sense or another. And then coming towards the end of our slides, here we see another church not too far from me, Greenstead Church. And of course, there were places where there were not stones available. There were not quarries available to mine building materials. What were the Christians in those areas to do? In fact, what had they done perhaps earlier before the stone buildings were built? They built churches out of wood. And Greenstead Church here has been dated back to as far as the mid-9th century. Again, it was a church built through the mission of St. Chedd. It's not too far from St. Peter on the Wall, 100 miles perhaps. It's in the south. He's come here and he's engaged in more mission work. And underneath this wooden and brick building, archaeologists have found the remains of simple buildings from his time that represent the very first Christian buildings on this site. And then a little later, a few hundred years later, in the time of about 845 to 1050, in that period, this particular wooden church was built. And let's see if we can look a little bit closer. Here you can see how it's made. And this is a Saxon form of building. And these timbers have been dated back to this period. It's not something that's just been put up last week by someone who went to a wood supplier. These are ancient timbers dating back 1100 years and representing the outline of the church. There was a wooden base along the walls, and in Victorian times that was replaced with a brick one. But the timbers are original. Of course, the roof is also later. But this represents an early wooden form of church from this period. And then as we come, just to look at a few crosses, because this is another one of the significant developments in this period. We saw some crosses in our second presentation, and they were generally quite rude. They were a pillar with a cross scratched on them, or a boulder that had some pagan significance with a cross scratched on them. But now, in this period, we start to see the flowering of cross construction. And again, we see that Christianity in this period is about creativity. It's about craftsmanship. It's about producing something beautiful. It reinforces that sense that Christianity is to involve every aspect of human endeavor and human experience. And the Kidalton Cross is found in Scotland on the island of Islay in the Inner Hebrides, and it was probably carved in the second half of the 8th century, 770, something like that. And there are others around, especially on Iona, which are similar. So this is part of the Ionan cultural context and environment. The parish church next door is roofless. It's an ancient church, not as ancient as the cross. We know that in these times, a cross would be established as a place where people came to worship, and there would be a wooden church for the service to take place. There are other crosses around this area, but this, the Kidalton Cross, it has a variety of panels representing different religious aspects. We can't see them all on this side, but there is the Virgin and Child on this cross, which is similar to one found on Iona. And experts say that there is some similarity to designs in the Mediterranean. In Egypt, there is this interlaced and woven and curly pattern found, not suggesting that there's a direct influence, but there were connections between England and Egypt, as we've seen in the past, England and the Middle East. And so it does seem that there is a similar vocabulary used in some ways in the crosses. This is at Clonmacnoise, and here you can see much more clearly how the cross might be used to have iconography on it, pictures on it, images on it that had a meaning. And Clonmacnoise was founded in 544. It's an ancient monastery of Ireland. Ireland was a place of very high Christian culture from a very early period. And when Columba went out to establish Iona, there was already a great wealth of Christian experience and spirituality and culture behind him in his homeland of Ireland. And this is called the Cross of the Scriptures. And it's 4 meters high, so it's a giant of a cross. And it has on it various panels showing the crucifixion, the Last Judgment, Christ in the tomb. This is actually a copy of it. The original is in the visitor center on this site. And it's thought that this cross was carved in 900. So we see that from the very early markings of the cross or the Chi-Rho on various stones, we come to these very, very highly decorated. Look at the figure of Christ in the center of the circle. You know how rich that is. You know, we see that there's a development throughout this period of increasing sophistication in all of the different endeavors that are used in architecture, in stonework, in manuscript production, even in textiles as far as we have them. And in the development of liturgy and in the organization of the church, we see an increasing sophistication. And then a church local to me, finally, before we look at the last pictures, St. Mary ad Castro. And if you come to England, this is in Dover Castle. Dover Castle is the great fortress of Britain, built to defend us from the French, and still kept in order in case we need it again. But originally there was an Iron Age fort, and you can just sort of see in the green, you know, there is actually a bank that goes around this church. There was an Iron Age and early Anglo-Saxon fort there. And the tower is not a bell tower. It was used as a bell tower, but it was actually a Roman lighthouse. This is a Roman lighthouse. How fortunate we are to have such remains here in the British Isles. Not as spectacular as some of those on the continent that I visited, but nevertheless, this is a Roman lighthouse, a pharos. And the church was built adjacent to it, probably in about 1000 AD, coming right to the very end of our period. There had already been a church there from about 630. You know, this was a Christian site for hundreds of years. But much of this particular building is from 1000 AD. We're starting to come to the end of this period, and we're starting to see that Britain looks quite a lot like the medieval Catholic Christian environment and landscape that came after the Norman conquest. Many of the Anglo-Saxon churches were knocked down by the Normans. They wanted to build their own statements of faith, and many of the Anglo-Saxon churches were made of wood and timber. So many of the churches we have around myself now today are Norman ones, if they're early, taking the place of Anglo-Saxon ones. But here we still have many churches with Anglo-Saxon features or churches that are mostly Anglo-Saxon, representing that Christianity had spread into every corner of the country. It was truly a national church by the time of the end of our period. And it was rooted in the monastic efforts, the missionary efforts, and the support of various Christian kings. And then I just want to return to Holywell. And I return to Holywell, which I think I showed in the second presentation. This is the place where St. Winifred was beheaded and miraculously raised from death by St. Bueno. And there is a holy well here that has been a place of pilgrimage for 1,000 and more years, 12 or 1,300 years. And the reason I have this, although these buildings here are obviously medieval, is to show the continuity from the earliest times. Still, British people and people from abroad come on pilgrimage here to a place such as St. Winifred's Well. And St. Winifred, with her own story of being a dedicated nun living in the woods, supported by monks living in other hermitages. This takes us into the Dark Age, the Celtic period. So we have this continuity from the earliest times. And even St. Bueno, we see elements of that sense that he is a Roman saint still, So we see in the British Isles not major discontinuities, even though the church suffered with the Anglo-Saxon invasion. We see these continuities, which produce the church and the experience even today. So that even today we are playing our part in a continuity of faith, a continuity of pilgrimage, a continuity of Christian experience. And here are the holy waters at Holywell. And they represent for me that sense that the church of today is one which is built on the Christian experience of the past in this first millennia. And the reason we are the country we are today, despite all of our faults, is because we are built on this experience of 1,000 years of Christianity in the first millennia, and then the developing Christian story afterwards. I hope that you found some of the things I said interesting. I'm sorry to go on so long, but each one of these slides has a story worth several hours behind it. But please, if you come to Britain, you are most welcome, and I'd be happy to meet any of you and share for a few hours in visiting some of these places. God bless you all. Thank you, Ilya.
Thank you so much, Father Peter. If you, our dear guests, have any questions, I'm going to turn your mics on by turning you off. All right, so you'll be able to turn the microphones on at will. Please ask any questions. Father Peter, it's absolutely spectacular presentation. As you mentioned, I just visited relatively recently, not long prior to COVID, most of those sites, and it just rings a bell close to my heart and mind. I do have a few questions, if I may, if I'm not delaying you too much. Going back all the way to your presentation on Iona, I know that in Lindisfarne, not much in the way of archaeological excavations, to my surprise, have been done. In fact, we're going to have Professor Betts from Durham University talking about excavations, the one whose presentation we both attended. I contacted him after presentation. He said he'll come and do the presentation just for us. So your microphone is off, so if you can please turn it on. So, but it's going to be probably sometime after Pascha. I'll be done with services, so it's going to be sometime mid-May or early mid-May. But as far as Iona, was there any archaeological excavations? All those placing of the monasteries, it's looking similar to a Coptic monastery. Is it a hypothetical suggestion, or is it confirmation by archaeological sources of sorts?
I don't think there has, off the top of my head, I tried to find some stuff. I don't think there has been that full-scale archaeological excavation in any of these places that you would hope for, that you would wish for. But there has been archaeological excavation. I've read some of the reports from Iona, outlining the monastic complex, discovering some features there. But I don't think there's been enough done there. you know, what you want is to discover the plan of the earliest monastery in Iona, in Lindisfarne, you know. But so much remains hidden, and especially under the later medieval complexes. If you can find someone to speak about the archaeology of Iona, then I would certainly want to listen to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could indicate, because he did say that Lindisfarne is the worst excavated, or the most under excavated place out of the similar places from that era. So I assume he does have some information, but I thought, since you mentioned, maybe you know something.
Yes.
But we'll wait for him to show up and talk to us, so we can ask him all sorts of questions.
Yes.
Another thing is, in your mind and in your research, it's sort of a double-handed question. First of all, the hurrying of England upon the Norman conquest. It's something of unprecedented, because Normans were literally destroying the churches, they're destroying the order.
Yes.
Literally, they're not only, it's not a gradual change, but it's a truly a Cromwellian or Bolshevikian or Islamic type of thing.
Yes, yes.
And similarly, people were very, very similar faith. Even if, to believe the account that Harold have transgressed by swearing on the oaths and relics, which seems to be a made-up story, but nevertheless, it's still very similar in many ways, very similar culture. As far as ethos goes, maybe not as much as visuals. Why? Another thing is, and it's second part of this very same question, absolute scarcity of any Christian Anglo-Saxon artifacts. Let it be crosses, let it be gospels, let it be any ecclesiastical things, you know, number of them are exquisitely rare. So it's also pretty evident that perhaps there was some utter cleansing and in pre-reformational time, because, you know, many artifacts in Germany or in France survived secularization of the monasteries and churches, French Revolution, all sorts of continental wars, which, with all due respect, was not any less, if not more, on the continent versus in England proper, so to say. So do we have indication that Normans were destroying that as well? So basically there was zero tolerance policy, or there are some different factors that contributed to it? Thank you.
I think that the Normans were basically Vikings again, weren't they? They were the Vikings who had settled in northern France, and they weren't the most Christian of people, and they were quite happy when the North rebelled against the northern invasion. They were quite happy to absolutely rape and kill their way across the country. It didn't matter to them who these people were. And for a long time, if you remember the story of Robin Hood, that's a story of English people with a Norman elite over the top. And that was what had happened when the Anglo-Saxons invaded. They didn't kill all of the British. The British didn't all leave, but you discovered you had a new lord who spoke a different language. I think that when they destroyed churches and monasteries, and the Vikings had already done this anyhow, you know, many priceless artifacts were lost. If you are leaving Lindisfarne, you will take the best of things, but there's a whole lot of stuff that you're in a hurry to leave, you know. If the message comes to you that the Vikings are coming, you know, and they're 10 miles away from your monastery, that happened many, many times. What do you take with you? You take the relics of your saint, you take the very best manuscripts, everything else will be burnt in the fire when the monastery is destroyed. But then we also have the Protestant Reformation, when all of the monasteries were destroyed in a much more successful manner than under the Vikings. Under the Protestant Reformation, there were no saints. There were hardly any saints who were spared. You know, it's very hard to imagine. I'm an Orthodox priest from an evangelical background. I would treat any Christian place of worship with respect. You know what I mean? It's very hard to imagine how can Canterbury, that abbey in Canterbury that I showed several times, that was where the relics of St. Augustine were. They had a great circular tower with all the shrines of the greatest saints. And the reason St. Theodore is safe is because by that time he wasn't so important, you know. All of the greatest saints were in this huge rotunda, and all of their shrines and all of their relics were just thrown out as if they were rubbish. You know, when that happens, if you don't care about the relics of the saints, you don't care about all of the manuscripts in the library. You know, everything goes on the fire. So there might have been a great many manuscripts from the earliest periods that were lost.
I don't have an answer for that.
Sorry, my phone for some reason has woken up. Go. We don't know what survived the Vikings. We don't know what survived the Normans, but we do know that a great deal was lost under the Protestant Reformation, under Henry VIII and the dissolution of the monasteries. When I go to the Abbey at Canterbury, you see a huge wall from the ancient church with brick along the top because it was turned into a smart house by someone. And personally, I can't imagine how could I buy a working church, knock down stuff, you know, and turn it into my house? How could I sleep at night? I don't know. But that happened over one generation in the 16th century. Every ancient monastery was closed within 20 years, you know. I think that's where much of our heritage was lost. And we're very fortunate that some of these other manuscripts managed to survive by being lost in one way or another, you know. I think that's where it went. Thank God we have such remarkable things, treasures. But as you say, what else might there have been, you know?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Father. A question came: who was responsible for forbidding of the veneration of the saints during the Reformation in England?
Well, Henry VIII, really. He prohibited pilgrimage. At first, he was a good Catholic. He had a disagreement with the Pope, but he was still a Catholic. But there was a strong Protestant party which wanted to go much further. And so pilgrimage was forbidden. The shrines were physically destroyed. It's very sad to visit a church where there was a shrine to a saint and there's nothing there anymore. Very important saints. All that you have is some mark in the ground that says this is where the shrine of Saint so-and-so was, you know. Within a generation, all of the major shrines in Britain had been destroyed. And the ones that are left are those in the tiny villages that no one bothered going to. If you hunt for them, you can find them. The shrine of King Edward the Confessor remained because no one quite dared to demolish the shrine of a king. But there was no problem demolishing the shrine of a great many saints. Canterbury Cathedral was filled with shrines to the saints, and now there's nothing there. Later on, under the Puritans, there was an iconoclasm, you know, and that's where all of the smashed statues come from, and the figures of bishops and saints with no heads. And it's not surprising that when traditional Christianity is forbidden, after a couple of generations, you no longer have that Christianity. It's very hard to remain Catholic as a country when all of your priests have been executed, you know. You end up losing the memory of it, you know. And I'm not a Catholic, but the efforts that Catholics went through in Britain to retain their faith, you know, it's commendable. It's not so much different to what happened in the Soviet Union, you know.
It's just absolutely horrible to observe it. You know, I've read quite a bit. I don't know how our other listeners, to what degree they're familiar with it. Maybe to some of them it's news, but for the first time I read it, I just could not believe that people would turn against their legacy so much.
Yes.
You know, one thing when it due as an institutional policy, it falls out of use and just fall in disrepair and things of that nature. But when there is such a concentrated effort to destroy it, you know, it brings the worst parallels with French Revolution, destruction of relics of Saint Martin and Tours, and demolishing of the most beautiful abbey at Cluny and so many other things, you know, where relics would be burned and such.
I mean, it does make me sad, but you know, it's difficult to imagine what people were thinking in those times. You know, if I go to the grave of John Wesley, you know, I'm moved and inspired by his life. You know, I don't have any desire to dig him up. You know what I mean? But that there wasn't that ability to think outside of your own box in those days. And as I've said through these three lectures, there was a continuity, you know, and the continuity carries on, but it became a slightly more fragmented one, increasingly more fragmented. But I do feel as British people, as Western people, this first millennia unites us, you know, because there was only really one church in Britain at that time, and we are the children of all of these Christians who were united at one time.
Yeah, that's wonderful. There's one more question, Father. Did Henry VIII offer any theological proof of his orders to stop venerating and honoring the saints?
Well, I'm not an to be honest, there are some people I find it very hard to study, and Henry VIII is one of them. He's not my most favorite of English people, although he was Welsh anyhow. He was getting his own back. It makes sense within a certain form of Protestantism. The Protestantism of that time was increasingly anti-clerical, anti what was seen as superstitious. That when you understand the development of Protestantism in its context, you can be sympathetic to people while also disagreeing. And I try always to be sympathetic. And I get into trouble when I'm writing because I don't say things in a black and white way, but things are rarely black and white. You know, you can understand where Martin Luther was coming from, but you don't have to agree necessarily with the outcome. You can understand the view of those who felt pilgrimages were superstition. But personally, as one who experiences pilgrimage myself, I don't view it as superstition. This is the problem when in the first millennia, we saw sometimes briefly where the partnership between Christianity and royalty was fruitful, you know, where each supported and encouraged each other. But here was a time in our history where when Christianity came under the influence of the state, it produced something terrible. We can see even in this last year how, whatever our views, how easy it is for the state to change completely our way of living. And we feel entirely obliged to go along with it, you know, unless we have some particular principle. You know, it must have been the same at various times in our history in different Western countries. I am a Catholic, I might say, but the last priest disappeared 20 years ago, you know. I'm trying to teach my children a little bit of my Catholic heritage, but how could my children really grow up to be Catholic? There's nothing for them to become except Anglicans, you know what I mean? And their own children have no remembrance of Catholicism. And then a little later, you discover that England is an anti-Catholic country. How is it possible to go from a Catholic country to an anti-Catholic country? And even in my own youth, I can remember a joint prayer meeting held in my town where some people from my church would not attend because there was going to be a Roman Catholic priest praying a prayer, you know. So it's very easy to change. Unfortunately, it's very easy to change the culture of a community. And that's what's happened in the past 500 years in Britain. But just as in terms of my orthodoxy, I like to speak with people about how we have a shared inheritance in the early church, in the first fathers. So as we talk about Christianity in Britain, I like to speak with people that we have a shared inheritance in our own common history here in Britain. And all of these people I've mentioned are our shared ancestors in our Christian experience. They don't belong particularly to any one of us.
Thank you, Father. Dear friends, if there are more questions for Father Peter, please don't hesitate to ask. It's really a walking encyclopedia, and I'm sure we'll provide you with a good answer.
I don't know how hard it is to find anyone who's interested.
Well, people are here, people are coming. In fact, I just get a question asking for a link to first of your lectures. And just in a way of kind reminder, if you are not going to back on us, we talked about Christianity in Cornwall and Isle of Man, and you said that you may deliver one more lecture, which would be
I'd be happy
absolutely
to do a
tremendous.
lecture on something specific. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I love to speak about Christian experience through the ages, you know, wherever it is. I am interested in all church history. It's interesting to me. It's my family history in a sense. It's our family history.
Excellent. Excellent.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you. If there are no more questions, I appreciate you all. Thank you so much for coming. In a way of announcement, next week we're going to have Dr. Linda Shafran from University of Toronto talking to us about cave monasteries in Apulia in southern Italy. And it's for the longest time was under the Byzantine Empire. It's a place where Eastern monks, well, they were there forever, let's put it this way, but whereas they flee from iconoclasm and from the Muslim persecution in different waves and ways they settled, and where there were Basilian or Eastern communities along with Western Benedictine communities residing side by side. And there are multiple caves, there are literally thousands of them, not an exaggeration, but there are nearly 400 where still frescoes remain, and some of them in absolutely perfect shape. It's something that is not very well known, but there are still Byzantine churches, and there are some villages where they still speak Greek, even though they Catholic by faith now, but there was a concentrated effort to convert them into Catholics, even as late as 20th century, especially under Mussolini. But anyway, we're going to talk about it, and she'll be open for your questions. So if you'd like to join us next week, I'll post an announcement on my Facebook page. Please share with your friends. Please join us. And of course, all the recordings of all our lectures are available on YouTube on the channel under my name. So you're most welcome to retrospectively look at any of the lectures that have been presented in the course of last year in English or in Russian, if you know the language. But Father Peter, thank you so much. We'll be definitely in touch, you know, about your next lecture, and just to be in comunicado, so to say. And dear friends, I'm looking forward to keep in touch. It's the very beginning of a great land for us, with Forgiveness Sunday being the inauguration. So I do ask for forgiveness if I somehow transgress against you, and ask for your prayers and a blessed Lenten journey. But again, our meetings would continue, and I'll be hopefully seeing you every so often. So thank you. And
thank you.
Good health to you all, blessings, and we will be in touch.
God bless. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.